She thought no one noticed her struggle, working double shifts at a rundown gas station just to keep the lights on and feed her daughter. But when a mysterious man pulled up late one night, everything Emily knew about life, survival, and hope was about to change forever. When you're stuck living day to day, drowning in bills and worries, it's easy to believe that kindness is just something people talk about, but never actually show. But sometimes the people you least expect to care become the ones who completely change your life. Stick around, because this is the story of how one small act from a stranger turned into a lifeline for a mom on the edge of losing everything. Emily never imagined her life would end up like this. She used to think that if you worked hard enough, stayed out of trouble, and did everything you were supposed to do, life would at least be fair. Maybe not perfect, but fair. But lately, fair felt like some cruel joke people told to make themselves feel better. Because for Emily, survival had turned into a full-time job, one she couldn't clock out of. Most mornings started long before the first hint of sunlight touched the sky. The cheap alarm on her phone would buzz angrily at 4:30 a.m., jolting her awake in the tiny, drafty apartment she and her daughter Mia called home. And there, lying under a pile of mismatched blankets on the living room couch they shared, Mia would stir. Every single morning, like clockwork, her little voice, still scratchy from sleep, would drift through the dark. "Mommy, is today the day we can go get pancakes?" It was such an innocent question, so small, so simple, but it broke Emily's heart every time. She'd pull her tired body up, force her lips into some version of a smile, and whisper back, "Soon, baby, I promise. Mommy just has to work a little more." But the truth, she didn't know if soon would ever come, because no matter how many hours she worked, no matter how many shifts she picked up, it was never enough. The bills were winning. Rent had been overdue for weeks now. The final notice letters had become a permanent fixture on the small, chipped kitchen table. A table that, more often than not, was buried under piles of unopened envelopes, all demanding money she didn't have. The fridge made an annoying humming sound that filled the silence late at night. It wasn't the noise that bothered her. It was the emptiness inside. A half-full carton of milk, a couple of sad, shriveled apples, leftovers from a meal Mia barely touched because, honestly, you can only make rice and canned beans taste like a real dinner so many times. And the job? Well, the gas station wasn't exactly the career Emily had dreamed of. It was soul-sucking work, standing on her feet for 12-hour shifts under fluorescent lights, ringing up cigarettes and energy drinks for people who barely made eye contact. She'd cover extra shifts whenever anyone called out sick, because she couldn't afford not to. Late nights, early mornings, doubles, over and over, until her legs ached so badly she could barely climb the stairs to their apartment. Some nights when Mia was finally asleep, her little body curled up on the worn-out couch they shared, Emily would sit alone in the dark, the only light coming from her phone screen. She'd open her banking app and stare at the negative balance. Refresh, refresh, refresh. Like maybe, by some miracle, the numbers would change, but they never did. And every day seemed heavier than the one before. The car she relied on to get to work was on its last legs. The check engine light had been on for months. Every time she turned the key, she held her breath, praying that it would make it just one more trip. Mia's school sent home field trip permission slips she couldn't sign because they came with fees she couldn't cover. Even things as small as shampoo or a new pair of socks for Mia had become choices that required careful thought. Do I buy the socks, or do I hold off and hope the old ones last another week? It was humiliating, exhausting, and worst of all, Mia was starting to notice. Kids are way smarter than we give them credit for, and Mia, as young as she was, could see the cracks forming. She noticed how her mom's smiles looked forced lately, how her laughter didn't last as long as it used to, how she snapped over little things that never used to matter. Mia never said it out loud, but Emily could feel her watching, like she was starting to understand that something was very, very wrong. The pressure was endless. There was no backup plan, no extra savings tucked away, no family nearby to help, no miracle coming. It was just Emily and this impossible balancing act. One unexpected bill, one more missed paycheck, one more car repair, and it would all come crashing down. And honestly, Emily was beginning to wonder how much longer she could keep pretending like she had this under control. Because there's only so long you can keep fighting before something inside you just breaks. And on that particular night, the one where the cold crept through the wish station's thin walls, the cash register drawer was nearly empty, and the tip jar had barely a handful of coins. Emily felt closer to that breaking point than she ever had before. She had worked an entire shift for little more than enough to buy a gallon of milk. A whole night, and that was it. What was the point anymore? She couldn't keep living like this. But as she stood there, rubbing her tired eyes and debating whether she could make it through the next hour without crying, she heard the low rumble of an engine pulling into the lot. Headlights cut through the darkness. A sleek black SUV rolled up to pump number 4, and inside, behind the wheel, sat a man who was about to change everything. Not that Emily knew that yet. At the time, it was just another customer, just another transaction. But sometimes, help doesn't arrive with fireworks or big announcements. Sometimes it pulls quietly into a gas station parking lot on an ordinary night when you've just about lost hope. And that's exactly what was happening. Even if Emily didn't realize it yet, Bryan Cranston didn't look like a man who belonged in a place like this. Not at midnight, not in this part of town, where most cars were either rusted-out hand-me-downs or clunky sedans coughing through their last few miles. But there he was, rolling into the station in a spotless black SUV that seemed almost too polished to sit under the flickering lights of the parking lot. His clothes were simple, nothing flashy, but they were clean, crisp, like they'd been put on fresh out of the dryer that morning, not after a 16-hour shift. When he walked through the door that night, Emily barely glanced up. She was too busy counting pennies in her head, calculating whether tonight's tips would be enough to pick up groceries in the morning. "Pump 4, he said with an easy smile, placing his card on the counter. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that didn't sound tired or worn down by life. Emily processed his transaction like she did with everyone else, polite, efficient, detached. But then, as he signed the receipt, he slid a folded $100 bill across the counter. She blinked at it, sure it was a mistake. "Sir, I think you left." "That's for you," he interrupted softly. Her first instinct was to refuse. "That's way too much. I can't accept that." Bryan just shrugged as if he handed out $100 tips every day. "Call it a thank you," he said. "I know these late shifts aren't easy." And before she could argue, he was gone. The door chimed. The SUV drove off, and Emily was left standing there holding a $100 bill, wondering what kind of person did something like that, and why. She figured that would be the end of it. Just some generous stranger passing through on his way to somewhere better, dropping a little kindness into a place most people forgot existed. But 2 nights later, just after midnight, the same SUV pulled in again. Bryan walked through the door like it was the most normal thing in the world. Coffee this time. Black, no sugar. And this time he lingered. Not long, just a few extra minutes. Just long enough to ask small, harmless questions. "So how long you been working here? You live nearby?" "Your daughter, Mia, right? How old is she?" Emily kept her answers short. She wasn't rude, but she didn't exactly open up either. Life had taught her better than that, because people always had an angle. There was always a catch. But Bryan didn't push. He listened, smiled, paid, left. And then he came back again and again and again. What started as the occasional late-night customer became something Emily found herself quietly looking forward to. Every few nights, like clockwork, his SUV would roll in, and for just a little while, her night felt lighter. It wasn't just the money anymore. Though his tips were still more generous than anyone else's, it was the conversation, the simple human act of someone seeing her. Not just the exhausted cashier behind the counter, not just the single mom barely hanging on, but her. And Bryan Cranston noticed things, little things most people overlooked, like how she kept rubbing her neck because the chair behind the register was broken and barely held together with duct tape, or how she limped slightly from standing for 12 hours straight on the unforgiving tile floors, or how her old beat-up car was parked in the corner of the lot with a flat tire that she hadn't been able to afford fixing yet. One night after their usual small talk, Bryan reached into his jacket and slid an envelope across the counter. "What's this?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed. "Just open it." Inside was a voucher for a full set of brand new tires from the shop down the street, paid in full. Emily's hands trembled. "Bryan, I can't accept this." But he just shook his head. "You can, and you will," he said, his voice low and kind. "It's getting colder. Roads are gonna ice over soon. I wouldn't sleep right knowing you're driving your little girl around on bald tires. Please." Emily didn't have words. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had done something for her, not without expecting something back. But Bryan wasn't finished. A few nights later, he showed up carrying a small gift bag. Inside was a plush bunny with floppy ears and a pink ribbon. For Mia, he said with a shy smile. My daughter had one just like it when she was little. Thought maybe yours would like it. Emily blinked, utterly speechless. How did this happen? How did someone like Bryan show up out of nowhere and just decide to care? In a world that had been so cold, so unforgiving, for so long, it felt impossible. But somehow, Bryan made it feel normal. In every visit, he chipped away at the walls Emily had built to protect herself from the disappointment of hoping for too much. She started telling him little things, how Maya wanted to be a veterinarian because she loved animals, how Emily used to bake before money and time ran out, how once upon a time, back when she was 20 and still believed in happy endings, she thought she might open her own bakery. And Bryan, he never judged, never pitied her. He just listened with the kind of quiet attention that made her feel like, for once, her story was worth hearing. And for the first time in years, Emily started to wonder, maybe life didn't have to stay this way. Maybe she wasn't trapped forever. Maybe people like Bryan existed, but nothing and absolutely nothing could have prepared her for what came next. Because one night, long after the last car had left and the gas station had fallen back into its usual silence, Bryan walked through the door. There was something different about him, a hesitation, like a man working up the nerve to say something big. And when he finally spoke, Emily heard words she couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. Words that would change everything. Forever. It had been one of those nights where exhaustion didn't just cling to Emily. It felt like it was stitched into her skin. Every blink felt like a battle to stay awake, and her body ached in places she didn't even realize could hurt. It was well past midnight, and the world outside the gas station felt like it had slowed to a crawl. The parking lot was empty, the roads were silent, and the cold night air bit through her thin jacket like needles pressing against her skin. But even though she was freezing, she stayed out there. It was her only break of the night. 10 minutes of quiet, 10 minutes of stillness before she'd have to force herself back inside to deal with the rest of the shift. She sat hunched on the curb behind the building, her phone clutched in her hands, the cracked screen glowing faintly in the dark. Same routine as always, scrolling through job postings, scanning through listing after listing, and yet every single one felt like a slap in the face. 3 years experience required, bachelor's degree preferred, must be available weekends and evenings, and on it went. All the jobs seemed designed for people who didn't live her life, people who didn't have a 6-year-old daughter asleep on a couch, relying on them for every meal and every bill, people who had family to help with babysitting, people who hadn't already stretched themselves so thin they felt like they might snap at any second. She scrolled, and then, as always, closed the app with a sigh. What was the point? Back to work, back to surviving, back to pretending like things were okay when they absolutely weren't. She was so lost in that downward spiral that she didn't even notice the familiar black SUV rolling into the parking lot until there was a gentle knock on the window behind her. Startled, she looked up, and there was Bryan. Hey, he said, his breath visible in the cold night air. Got a minute? Emily quickly stood, brushing the dirt off her jeans, trying not to look as exhausted and beaten down as she felt. Yeah, of course, she replied, half expecting him to hand her another envelope or maybe another little gift for Mia. Bryan always seemed to have some surprise up his sleeve, but this time, his hands were empty, and there was something different about him. This wasn't his usual calm, easygoing self. Tonight, there was a nervous energy about him. He rubbed the back of his neck, glanced down at the ground, then back up at her like he was trying to find the right words, but wasn't sure how to start. I hope I'm not crossing a line here, he said slowly, but I wanted to ask you something. Emily's heart started to pound. Sure, what's up? He took a deep breath, like he was about to make a speech. So, I own this small business downtown. It's nothing fancy, but we're growing and, well, we're looking for someone reliable to help manage the front office. Full-time, decent pay, health insurance, weekends off. Emily just stared at him, frozen. She must have misheard him. Surely she did, because what he was describing didn't sound like something that happened to people like her. Wait, what? A job offer? An actual job offer? She blinked a few times like maybe the cold was playing tricks on her, and then without meaning to, she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt so impossible that her body didn't know what else to do. Bryan, I think you've got the wrong person, she finally said, shaking her head. I don't have a degree. I've only ever worked in places like this. I'm not qualified to run an office. But Bryan just smiled, that same patient, steady smile that somehow made you feel like everything might actually turn out okay. Emily, I'm not looking for someone with fancy credentials. I'm looking for someone who knows how to work, someone who shows up, someone who doesn't quit when things get hard. You've been holding this place together night after night, taking care of your daughter, juggling all of it without falling apart. You think someone like that can't handle answering phones and organizing paperwork? Trust me, you're exactly who I need. She opened her mouth to protest again, but the words never made it out. Because the truth was, nobody had ever believed in her like that. Nobody had ever looked past the uniform, past the tired face behind the counter, and seen anything other than a struggling single mom barely scraping by. But Bryan saw her. For the first time in so long, someone wasn't offering her a handout. He was offering her a real shot, a real, honest chance to step out of survival mode and finally build something better. I'd need to figure out childcare, she stammered. Bryan nodded. We've got flexible hours. Take your time, talk it over with Mia, but the job is yours if you want it. Emily felt her throat tighten. She wasn't used to moments like this, moments where things turned around, moments where the weight she'd been carrying around for years suddenly felt like it might actually lift. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking. Really, I mean it. Thank you. But Bryan shook his head. No, he said softly, thank you. You've reminded me what real hard work looks like. Just promise me one thing. Anything, she said. When it's your turn to help someone else, do it. And for the first time in months, Emily felt something she thought she'd lost completely. Hope. She smiled, really smiled. Not the forced one she wore for Mia or for customers, but the kind of smile that comes from deep down, the kind you can't fake even if you tried. I promise, she said. That night, as she drove home, the streets felt different, lighter. The weight on her shoulders wasn't gone, not completely, but it was the first time in a long time it didn't feel impossible to carry. And when Mia met her at the door, rubbing her sleepy eyes and asking, Mommy, is tomorrow finally pancake day? Emily didn't hesitate. She knelt down, hugged her tight, and whispered back, Yeah, baby, tomorrow we get pancakes. And for the first time, she meant it. Tomorrow wasn't just another day to survive. Tomorrow felt like a beginning, something worth waking up for. It's strange, really, how life can turn on a dime. One minute you're drowning, barely treading water, clinging to whatever scraps of hope you have left. You tell yourself this is it, that this is as good as it's going to get, that survival's the only thing left to aim for. And then, out of nowhere, someone steps into your world and reminds you that maybe, just maybe, you're allowed to dream again. That's exactly what happened to Emily. If you had told her just a few months ago that she'd be here now, clocking out from a real job, driving a car that actually works, filling a shopping cart without checking her bank balance every 5 minutes, she would have laughed in your face. Back then, her life was just one long, exhausting blur of late nights and early mornings, shifts that never seemed to end, paychecks that evaporated the moment they hit her account, a constant loop of stress, worry, and quietly wondering how much longer she could keep up the act. But now the woman who once stood behind a gas station counter, praying her car would start and silently counting pennies to see if she could scrape together dinner, spends her days working in an office where people actually see her, where they say things like, great job today, Emily, and suede, and mean it, where she earns enough to pay the rent early instead of dancing around eviction notices, enough to fill the fridge with real food, not just the bare minimum to get by, enough to say yes when Mia brings home permission slips from school, instead of folding them up and hiding them in a drawer while pretending they never came. And Mia, she's different too. Gone are the quiet, heartbreaking questions about when things would finally get better. She doesn't ask those anymore. Now she's busy packing her little backpack for field trips, laying out clothes on her bed the night before, deciding which outfit makes her look the most grown-up for the zoo. And to anyone who will listen, Mia proudly announces that her mom works in a fancy office downtown. Their little apartment feels different now, too. It's not just four walls anymore. It's a home, warm, safe, full. The fridge hums, but now it hums with purpose. It's packed with fresh fruit, cartons of juice, leftovers from real dinners they cooked together. There's art on the walls, mostly Mia's drawings, proudly framed in dollar store frames, but somehow they make the place feel alive. And on the kitchen counter, a permanent stack of pancake mix, because now Saturday mornings are pancake mornings. It's a tradition, a promise Emily made, and finally kept. Every weekend, without fail. No double shifts to race off to. No worries about whether she can afford the extra eggs. Just her and Mia, sitting at the table, syrup dribbling down their plates, laughing like people who have finally exhaled after holding their breath for way too long. And every now and then, when Emily's driving Mia to school, or sitting quietly with her coffee in the early morning calm, in the kind of silence that used to feel heavy, but now feels peaceful, she thinks about Bryan. She thinks about how impossibly close she came to giving up. About how, if he hadn't stopped that night, if he hadn't looked at her and seen more than just another cashier behind the counter, if he hadn't asked how she was doing and actually cared about the answer, well, honestly, she has no idea where she and Mia would be right now. And that's the thing about kindness nobody really talks about. It doesn't end with the person you help. It grows, spreads, multiplies, like wildfire. Now that Emily's standing on her own 2 feet, she's made a quiet promise to herself to keep that fire going. There's a new girl at work, young, nervous, always checking her phone like she's waiting for bad news. Emily recognizes the look in her eyes. She's been there. So now, when she notices the girl slipping out during lunch to call the power company and beg for a few extra days, or skipping meals because she's not hungry, Emily finds subtle ways to help. A gift card tucked into her purse when she isn't looking. A paid lunch left on her desk with a note that just says, "Hang in there." Because now Emily knows exactly how much those little acts of kindness matter. They're not small, not to someone who's drowning. And whenever people ask her why she bothers, why she goes out of her way to help someone else when she's only just gotten back on her feet, she always gives the same answer. Because someone did it for me. That's how it works. One person decides to care. One person chooses to show up. One person reaches out a hand not because they expect anything back, but because they know exactly what it feels like to be standing in that same place. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. For Emily, it was one man, on one cold, rainy night, who made the decision to be more than just another customer passing through. And because of him, tomorrow doesn't feel like something to dread anymore. Tomorrow feels wide open, full of possibilities, full of hope, and of course, pancakes. If this story moved you and reminded you how powerful a simple act of kindness can be, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss more stories just like this.